Good morning. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for today's coffee talk. My name is Sean O'Brien, the president of QuickRate, and as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today for another installment of our Friday Coffee Talks. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the director of analytics here at QuickRate and QwickAnalytics, and I've spent my entire career working with community banks all around the country, and more than half of that now has been right here with Sean at QuickRate.
Thank you, Steve. Just a couple of reminders. We will be sending out a link to today's recording along with the copy of the slides throughout the presentation today. Certainly chat with us or use the Q&A box. We will monitor those for questions, and we will take those at an appropriate break or certainly at the end of the discussion. So yeah. But you will receive a copy of the slides and a link to the recording, likely in an email Monday afternoon, early Tuesday morning. So thank you all for joining us. Again, just a reminder, it's been a little bit. So, again, we just want to kind of share what we're hearing. Steve did some analysis we're going to discuss. I think at this point, I think everybody is really, managing their CECL process really well, right? I think, a lot of the questions we get today are usually from auditors or regulators, particularly just about why is this done this way or that. But I think just overall management of the process continues to be done really well by all of you. So congratulations to that. So we thought today we would just try to, talk a little bit more, maybe just even about the reserve and just some other things that we're seeing. And we'll share those with you as well. But as always, we would like to start with just a couple of polling questions. And again, I think these are probably, I think probably better than we thought we might be beginning of the year. But how would you describe your current credit quality environment? Improving, deteriorating, or uncertain? I think for the most part, a lot of things this year kind of feel just steady as she goes. But just kind of interested to see where everyone is at this point. So we'll give this just another 10 or 15 seconds. Okay, perfect. We share the results. So 45% uncertain, not surprising. 42% improving. That's encouraging, and 13% deteriorating. So thank you for participating in that one. Let's go to the next question, just around that CRE concern. If any, which CRE subset gives you most concern? 1 to 4 family rental, industrial warehouse, owner occupied, multifamily, retail, farmland, office, hospitality, or none. So again, we'll just give this 15 to 30 seconds. Okay. Again, thank you for participating. Looks like not retail and office are kind of leading the way, with hospitality, none as the next highest respond rate. So thank you again. Oops, I don't know if I shared that or not. Let me put those back up there so everybody can see them. You can see the 1 to 4 family, industrial, and we'll scroll down and you can see retail, office, hospitality, and none. So thank you all again for answering on that one. And we'll go to the final question just around stress testing. In the past year, which stress test type have you used at your financial institution? So we're asking this today. I mean, I will say one thing that we are kind of starting to hear just a little bit more consistently is requests from auditors and regulators, asking institutions about if they're stress testing at all. They're not necessarily prescribing that they do one, but they are asking if they are doing one. So we thought it might be a timely ask here in this in this audience as well. So we'll give this one just another 10 or 15 seconds. Okay, and that one, I'll share it this time more timely. So 37% of you are doing it at the portfolio level, 19% at the loan level, 26% both. That's interesting to see, and then 18% neither. So again, we'll include these results in our email early next week. But again, just appreciate everybody joining us this morning and certainly participating in these polling questions. Okay, so as always, we always just kind of put this up here, things we have updated or enhanced, things we are working on. Again, our design or our desire here is to never really touch the tool itself, but if there are ways to streamline things, we get a lot of suggestions, and so when we try to kind of percolate those within our IT team, and Steve kind of leads that, and just decide if there's things that would be better presented or by us, or maybe it's a user feature. If we can do that, we're always looking to do that. So the scenario organization and management tool is certainly one of those that I think has been well received. And so Steve, if you want to talk about a couple of the coming soon attractions, feel free.
Yeah, thanks. So we've the scenario organization and management was earlier. I think it was end of first quarter, beginning of second quarter of this year, and we've had a lot of good feedback on that. We have a lot of all of our best users have lots of scenarios in there, so it's good to see. It's good to see that they need more organization for all the scenarios that they're running using the tool. And what we're going to be looking at adding, and we're currently working on in the second half of this year, is just additional flexibility in looking at peer historical losses. There's lots of different ways you can look at the universe of peer institutions, not just looking at median levels, but also sort of stressing peer losses going back in time, especially when we're looking at certain asset quality metrics that during a healthy environment are negligible or near negligible. The ability to go further back in time and the ability to stress those results by looking at, say, 75th and 90th percentile loss rates and whatnot gives a lot more flexibility and the ability to see trends even when the typical quote median bank is sort of flatlined at or near zero, especially when it comes to things like net charge-off ratios, but also things like reserve to coverage ratios, right? Reserve to non-performing loans. If everyone's got zero non-performing loans, then the reserve to non-performing loans is going to be a non-calculable number because the denominator will be zero. So additional flexibility there will give you guys a lot of more ways to spot long-term trends and use that to help justify qualitative factor adjustments and everything else moving forward. We are also working on let's call it a simplified methodology for the unfunded commitment. I think this is something we've mentioned once or twice in the past that we're still working on, but obviously, just like the regulators said that when they first did the first round of examinations after CECL became a law of the land, they were going to be looking for a good faith effort for institutions to try to recalculate their reserves using CECL. And then over time, they would iterate their expectations, right? They would sharpen the point and start asking more questions and expect more thorough analyses and be refining their expectations of what institutions, community financial institutions are doing for CECL. We've certainly seen that in the examination process and in our discussions with examiners and auditors and what they really like about the tool and what are some hiccups or some catch points or things that can potentially lead to more questions and scrutiny of some of our customers' solutions for CECL. And so we came up with an even more sort of streamlined and simplified way to think about and look at the unfunded commitment reserve that we think will go over well and sort of massage some of those pain points from some auditors and examiners that we've discussed with over time as they refine kind of what they expect to see from all of our users. So Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to add, again, I think just I would add to what Steve said, both about the unfunded commitments. Again, some of you have already been doing a process. I think this will give you some flexibility to even kind of, ingrain that into what we're doing is beyond the solutions we're suggesting. And then, the pure historical loss flexibility, again, I think as Steve was indicating, we'll kind of combine some of the best components of our stress test and try to incorporate it into the CECL tool, which I think will be pretty exciting.
Yeah, and with just like Sean mentioned, with everything, just like everything else, we went ahead, that new alternative methodology, not that it's a different complete methodology, it's just sort of streamlined, will be an option. So if you have save scenarios and you're fine with the unfunded commitments and your examiner's fine, so you certainly don't want to poke the bear, you can keep doing it exactly the way you've been doing it. You'll just have another alternative if you'd like to switch, or if that's been a pain point for you in discussions and you want to go to something else. So
again, I think that's we want to emphasize the fact that we're not changing anything. We're just trying to give you more options and streamline it if we can. So so as Steve and I were talking this week, and Steve, I think he probably felt like he was cramming for a final exam this week. We were talking about he's had a lot going on, and we had this idea to talk a little bit about what I had kind of noticed is since the years have been a little bit quiet. I think most, even though maybe past dues are up a little bit, charge-offs aren't dramatically up for most institutions. Just to kind of look back and see where the reserve has been and what's kind of happened, really since COVID or even right leading into COVID, and with the change from the ALLL to the ACL. And so Steve, kind of went down a bunch of rabbit holes preparing this. So Steve, you want to talk a little bit about?
Well, I don't know about a final exam. I mean, this is my bag here. This is my wheelhouse. So I'm a numbers guy. So everybody buckle up for a few minutes so we can get into it. But I start small and I softly walk away. All right, go ahead. So this is we're gonna do a little exercise here for just a couple minutes. Credit metrics at memorable points in history. So there's three metrics we're looking at: loan loss reserve, non-performing loans as a percentage of total loans, and then net charge-off ratio. And there's three different points in time. And I just want everyone to sit down and think for a minute and do your best to write down or guess on paper or just guess in your head what those three dates A, B, and C might be. I'll give you a hint in a minute so you can refine your guess, but think about that for a few seconds.
I'm going to give you your hint yet, Steve?
All right, go ahead. Next slide is the hint.
Yeah.
All right, hint. One of those dates is around the beginning of COVID. One of those dates is just before CECL and implementation, like the quarter before CECL implementation. And one of those dates is June 30th of this year, current. So can you guess which one is which? All right.
I'll take to the next slide. Oh. All right, whoops. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, sorry. I should have had the dates in there.
Yeah, I thought I did.
I'm not telling anybody. I'll go to my grave with it. Now, so I put them in chronological order. So the first date is 12/31/2019. And so it was, first quarter of 2020. So it was the beginning of COVID. And then the second one was right before we implemented CECL, so 12/31/22. And then the third one, date C, is current, June 30th, 2025. So you'll notice the loan loss reserves right as COVID was hitting was about 122. And then a couple years later, right before we implemented CECL, 126. Now, 122. Non-performing loans, interestingly, was about 50 basis points of total loans heading into COVID, and had dropped down to about 21 basis points right before CECL implementation, and has bumped up a little bit to 36 basis points. And net charge-off 0, 0, and 0.01. So go ahead, head to the next slide here.
Yeah, and I think what as Steve and I were talking about, what I found kind of interesting, right, is we obviously for many of you, you've heard me say this. You probably heard me when I on the demo when we were talking about CECLSolver, right? In many ways, the ACL change was, we were playing the same game with a new set of rules, right? There was a lot of noise and obviously a lot of consternation and time spent on all of your parts having to implement a new methodology. But the bottom line is we kind of got back to where we've always been, right? And I think at the end of the day, for most of us, right, you can see the non-performers, have varied a little bit. The charge-offs have remained benign. So for most of us, right, we're still substantiating or defending our reserve with Q factors. And again, a lot of the machinations that we've gone through, we know, right? If you're between 1 and 1.25 with your reserve, for the majority of us, that is going to carry the day. And so again, I kind of looked at it because as we were looking at our reserve at the community bank where I'm a director, it kind of occurred to me, just it felt like we were just kind of in the same spot. And so then that's when Steve and I started talking about, just maybe what was happening industry wide. And this is it kind of confirmed it, right? We're just kind of where we've been always as an industry. So, all right, Steve, next slide.
So I figured I'd start looking at some of that data and just plotting it. So when you plot it in a sort of a chunky way, just looking at year-end values over, let's say, a decade, the only thing that really, the couple things that you'll notice is it's a very, very skinny range, right? This is, for here, I just chose UBPR peer group 5 as a proxy for community banks, right? All the 300 million to $1 billion. So it doesn't have the smallest community banks, doesn't have the biggest community banks, but it's got about a quarter of the banks in the country in that peer group. So it's a pretty good idea of the experience for a typical community bank. What we had coming into 2015 was that long trail off that we had since the last credit cycle, right? Where reserves have been coming down since the last credit cycle in 2012, 2013. And but you just don't see that much variation here along an entire decade. You've got a max of 11 basis points at the annual level going back to 2015 and beyond. So, but if we get a little bit more granular on the next slide, we'll be able to get a little bit better of an idea of what's going on. So this is, you can see here reserves coming down over the entire second half of the or really the most of the entire decade of the teens. The three highlighted areas are the ones that I was just alluding to earlier. June 30th of 2020 was the pretty much when we first started seeing COVID have any impact on the banking industry. And then we saw the highlighted area of the middle one there is right before and right after CECL started. And then obviously that's the last one is the current one. What I find interesting is that everyone was so concerned that CECL implementation would result for even for community banks in pretty much a completely new world for reserves, and in a very large increase was concerned across was a big concern across the board for years and years, which one of the reasons why the implementation was delayed for so long. But what we did notice is we had a sizable well, everything's in a small range here, but we had a 15 basis point increase in reserves over a year and a half as a result of COVID. We'll talk in a minute as to whether that was really necessary or not. But of course, that was the the regulatory requirement at the time. Whereas we only had a 2 basis point increase in reserves during the beginning of CECL. So I have to do a little foreshadowing here because it's important for this chart. But suffice to say, non-performing loans did not increase during COVID, period. They continued to decrease during COVID for community banks. Despite that fact, reserves saw a not completely insignificant increase as a result of perceived additional risk. Whether that risk was actually hitting the balance sheet or not, looks like it was not. But there was a perceived risk. Whereas the accounting change, the big accounting change a year and a half later, was pretty much a non-event for the industry as when it comes to total reserve levels. And we are right now exactly where we were pretty much at the beginning of COVID, went from a reserve standpoint. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think again, I think it just, to me, it was just, you can exhale a little bit, right? Like we've recognized the change. We've, incorporated the change, embraced the change. We're managing the process very well, and we're back to, levels that we, traditionally seen. All right. So Steve, we have a question. I have a
Yeah.
question on the current method used for unfunded commitments. How should we adjust if we have a current portfolio segment that has a WARM that is less than a year? If we would we make the adjustment in the weighted average remaining column E, if we don't make an adjustment somewhere in the calculation. So I think it's an example when we have less, since we do the unfundeds on the annual loss rate, and when you get a shorter than a year, it kind of inverts
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
math.
that's something I'd want to sit down and look at the numbers
Yeah.
with you. So maybe if you could we'll reach out after the call
Yeah,
and
just
set up a time where we can chat, because I can give a generic answer, but I kind of want to see what the numbers specifically are to see if the math is working out or not. There's always, some funky things that happen on the unfunded commitments in abnormal or less than common situations.
perfect. Okay. Yeah, please email Steve and I afterwards, and we'll circle back with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then we started looking at, another level of granularity, same time period, looking for kind of before COVID through today. And I wanted to see what was going on at different asset sizes of banks, from the smallest banks, the blue line, all banks under 100 million, all the way up to the orange line, which is all banks over $10 billion. These are all median reserve levels over time. And I've highlighted the same 3 time periods in yellow. I also highlighted 12/31/19 to because that is when, if you guys remember, for the biggest institutions, they had to implement CECL a couple of years before you guys did. And so they implemented at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. So you'll see there for large regional and national banks, the median reserve level skyrocketed from 84 basis points in the fourth quarter of 2019 to 1.21% in the first quarter of 2020. Right. And we do know that a lot of large banks took advantage of the transitional provisions that the regulators put in there, meaning that they could do a one-time increase to the reserve without, and then have the effect on retained earnings and regulatory capital be phased in over a few years. A lot of people took a big advantage of that and went ahead and doubled, tripled their loan loss reserve at that point in time, kind of threw the big chunk right in there. And so that's exactly what happened. But you'll see that there was a pretty wide variety, right? Before COVID and before CECL, anyone was implementing CECL, there was a pretty significant disparity in reserve levels between the biggest and the smallest banks, anywhere from 90 basis points to 1.3% for the smallest banks. If you look all the way on the right now, on the current quarter for June 30th, the disparity is greatly shrinking. Pretty much no matter what asset size of a bank you are, 120 to 125 is now the kind of the midpoint. So it used to be, like I said, it used to be, bigger banks or big community banks in the $1 billion range had a lower reserve than the smaller community banks by a significant margin, by 20%. And now that's more like 5% or less. And so there's they're all kind of coordinating much more than they used to. But you'll see here that same sort of trend, right? Where the biggest banks had a big increase. And then as a result of COVID, we see reserves went up across the board for a period of time, and then they started trickling down. And then you see again with all the asset classes, when implementation happened for everybody else, including some of the banks right around the $10 billion range, you see a slight increase and then reserves trickling back down. But again, reserves today kind of look like they did in 2018, 2019, just a little bit tighter between asset classes as opposed to less, more spread out. John. Yeah. So after
so next slide. Yep.
yeah, after looking at reserve levels, what we want to do is, well, let's look at non-performing loans. So we did the same analysis over the same time period, and we see that there was a, if you look at the, during COVID 2020 right there, we saw a slight increase, a little increase in non-performing loans at the biggest banks in the country. But if we're just looking at all the other lines other than the orange one, so pretty much the universe of community banks, COVID didn't have any significant increase in non-performing loans in the industry, and they continued to decrease till they hit a low of, just coincidentally, right around the time that we had the change in reserve levels. Right, that's part of the system that we deal with, where things like reserves lag, and the industry's response to economic cycles is lags by so many years that they seem to be a business cycle behind in the regulatory from a regulatory standpoint. By the time we're implementing something to fix bad asset quality problems, we have some of the best asset quality we've ever seen in history. But so while reserves have stayed pretty much flat, non-performing loans continue to decrease all the way through the beginning of CECL, and now have started trickling back up over the last couple of years. So in the last slide, or not last slide, in the next slide. So what we get here is, and there's a big asterisk on this particular chart, which I'll get to in a couple minutes. But as we would expect, right, if reserve levels are staying about the same, and non-performing loans are decreasing in 2019 through 2023, you're going to expect to see a significant increase in the coverage ratio, coverage being reserve as a percentage of non-performing loans, right? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times your non-performing loans in reserves. And that peaked, well, right before or right around when CECL was implemented. And since that point in time, again, reserves did not see that huge jump during when we implemented CECL, and they have not seen any increase despite the increase in non-performers over the last 3 years or 2 years, 2.5 years since then. Non-performers have doubled industry-wide, and reserves are actually less than they were at that point. So what we would expect is what we see here is that coverage ratio has come down dramatically for all banks at all asset sizes. Now, one thing to note here is there's the coverage ratio as a metric is a challenging one once you start digging into the details and start spreading it out by different asset classes, because your reserve as a percentage of your non-performing loans keeps getting higher as your non-performing loans gets towards zero, right? But once it hits zero, once your non-performing loans is zero, as I think I alluded to earlier, that ratio is no longer calculatable, right? You can't have a reserve as a percentage of zero non-performing loans would be infinity. And so what we end up seeing is a lot of the smallest community banks, they're the ones that during lots of periods over the last few years have had literally zero non-performing loans. And so you take some of the vast majority of the best performing community banks from a non-performing loan standpoint are not included in this metric. That's why you see the smallest banks having the lowest coverage ratio compared to the largest banks as a median. And so that's why this trend you got to take with a table with a large grain of salt, because if I were to add a couple non-performing loans to each of those community banks just so I could get a ratio that's not infinity, you'd find that the smaller community banks have a higher coverage ratio than the larger community banks and then the regional and national banks, more to the tune of between 500 and 1,000% or 5 to 10 times their non-performing loans in their reserve on average. But when you're doing things like medians, you have to watch out for that. So the takeaway
I was gonna say that's the challenge with using a median, right? It just eliminates those. But I think it is interesting, right, as well, just how many banks, again, particularly the smaller ones, just don't have any non-performers, right? And it gets back to, again, why Q factor still remains such a huge part of our reserve analysis, just because again many of you just have not experienced much in charge-off activity. Sorry, Steve.
That's our the main takeaway here though is we all saw a significant increase in reserve coverage ratios until CECL was implemented, just coincidentally, right? It was because our non-performers continue to decrease and reserves have stayed, as we've seen, flat. Now those non-performers are increasing, and so our coverage ratios are all dramatically declining across the board.
Yep.
Next slide. There we go. This was a way I sort of I was able to do a different calculation here, and you can see the for all the banks in peer group 5 over time, where for 5 years our coverage ratio was in a relatively small range, between 1.5 and 2, and then it's skyrocketed to 4 to 5 times, and it's now come back to about 2.5 times.
All right. So as always, as new quarterly data comes available, we try to we do update our database, but then Steve just thought we'd share some additional insights that he's gathered as looking through that data as well. So Steve, take it away.
Yeah. So again, in addition to all the publicly available data, since we have such a robust database of institutions using our CECLSolver, we wanted to kind of ignore just the public data and see just from our own database exactly what trends we could see to see if it matches up with what we're seeing on the call reports, right? And this is just to give you guys an idea of what that database is. I know we've mentioned it before. I don't know if these numbers were updated since last quarter, but between 350 and 400 community banks using the tool, the CECLSolver. So that's how many institutions we're gathering scenario data on from 43 different states. So a wide range geographically, a wide range asset size wise, up to about 7,000 plus scenarios run at this point. And so I'm going to go ahead and.
You want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen here for just a second.
Yep.
All right, so there we are. This has all been updated with for June 30th. And so what we see here is these trends just give everyone an idea. I can click on a particular segment here. Let's say if I just go to total 1 to 4 family, I can see, for all of our users that are calculating their warms, we can see what the trend is in warm levels at the 25th percentile, median, and 75th percentile. So, one of those assumptions, there's a handful of assumptions like prepayment rates and whatnot that go into warm calculations. But when you're in an exam, when you're in an audit, and they're going through and they're either looking at your warm calculations, or you're trying to justify, kind of frame your warm calculations within the industry so that you can get an idea for whether they're within a typical span of our users. This is a great way to just allay any concerns that your examiner or auditor might have. If they don't feel like going through all your warm calculations with your loan level data, if you show them the results and then show them the, from hundreds of other institutions that you guys are kind of in the middle here, it might make some of those, an area where they might not feel the need to dive any deeper into your analysis. So it allows you I can toggle here between, these are all 25th percentiles, these are all medians, these are all 75th percentiles, and this is all exportable data. The export has been updated now, so that does have up through June 30th data. So that's your warms. You can also get the same idea with qualitative factor adjustments. So this is huge because qualitative factor adjustments are, by their very nature, qualitative, right? For the most part, your auditors, your examiners, they can't tell you what these are supposed to be. There is no supposed to, but they want to make sure you've got some points for pencil, that you have made a note of your assumptions for why you believe your Q factor adjustments should be X and not Y. And a big part of that will be comparing adjustments you've made with adjustments your peers have made. The rub there is that you don't know what anyone else's Q factors are. None of that data is anywhere close to public. However, since we have so many users and we can pull this data and aggregate it for you, now you have a way to really compare and contrast and check your Q factors and the direction, right? The direction your Q factors are headed versus about 10% of the community banks in the country using our tool. So while these might not be an absolute comparison to your qualitative factor adjustments, it is certainly a way to sanity check your Q factors and also see what direction your peers are headed. If their qualitative factors are going up across the board, going down, or whatnot. And then finally, oh, go
Yeah,
ahead,
and I
Sean.
just want to jump in here for a second, Steve, right? I think, and this to me kind of, dovetails with the earlier discussion around where reserve levels are, right? Obviously within QwickAnalytics, we're big, fans and proponents of peer data, right? You can see where you are, against a specific peer group, whether it's a UBPR, whether it's your state, whether it's one that's personally, crafted. As Steve said, for like Q factors and reserve levels, this just again is another piece of peer information that can be very informative about trends, right? Just where things are going, recognizing that for the most part, everybody's kind of swimming at the same levels. If there is a noticeable change in some of this stuff, it just might catch your eye and might be meaningful to consider. So again, I think it just reinforces, some of the value of incorporating, peer information, just as a quick check against what you're doing. All right,
Yeah.
sorry, Steve.
That's right. And these here, and we also have the ACL, so the reserve to loans on the, and these are for the not the individually assessed loans, but the cumulatively pooled loans. So you can compare these peer values to what we're calculating here, right? These implied CECL values for the for all the pooled loans separate from the individual ones. So if you want to compare and contrast what your peers are at on their reserve for specifically for 1 to 4 family, at the bucketed level, so to speak, that's a way to make that comparison as well.
So Steve, we had a question come in.
Okay.
Do we see banks using one warm method more than the other, such as adjusted for prepayments and straight line amortization versus prepayments only? I think initially, well, go ahead, Steve. I'll give my thoughts and you can give yours. I think more people have started to move to prepayments and straight line amortization. And again, just as a reminder, the big distinction there is when you calculate a warm, when we first came out, and this is probably my fault. I took a conservative approach and just said, if you just do a straight estimate of a warm with a maturity date and a loan balance, you get a warm. But what it doesn't take into account, of course, with the prepayment assumption, you get your warm. But what it doesn't take into account are the normal amortization payments that are occurring within a portfolio over that time. And so I think once we introduced an option, I think we've probably seen more people move to the including the amortization payments, because it does give you a shorter warm, and my sense is that most banks feel like that lines up more with their portfolio. And so I think that's ultimately the critical key, and I think why we offered both is that again, reserve methodologies within institutions, the spectrum is really not wanting to put more than 1 penny into the reserve than you have to, versus trying to defend putting as much as you can in, and everybody's in between that. And so we just wanted to give our options. But I think what we've seen is I feel like we see more banks have adopted now the straight line amortization. But I don't have any specific numbers, but my sense from being on calls is that's what I would say. Steve, what would you say?
I mean, when we were first developing the tool, the guidance was relatively sketchy, and we had no way of knowing, nobody really had any way of knowing exactly how granular they were going to be expecting people to be in their assumptions, whether they wanted people making assumptions about amortization, given different types of amortization that are possible, whether we're going to do this at the loan level and have amortization looking at each individual credit, or whether this could just be done at the portfolio level and not taking that into account. So they were kind of all over the place. And so given that, we wanted to use the most conservative methodology at the time. That was, and a more certainly if you're not adjusting down for amortization, right, you're going to have higher balances and over time, and that's going to amount to a higher WARM, which all things being equal, a longer WARM gives you more time to accumulate losses, right, in the portfolio. So it's going to lead to a higher reserve level. And especially when we were, if you think back to when we were implementing or before we implemented CECL, and asset quality was so pristine, people were looking for ways to have some part of the analysis not be all Q factors, right? So people were trying to find long WARMs so that they could use a larger period of historical data and assume larger historical losses so that the entire reserve wasn't 100% due to subjective Q factors. And so a conservative approach that would bring some of the losses at least into the historical frame, so it wasn't all on your Q factor assumptions, was kind of all the rage, so to speak. But as we got through CECL and over the first and then the second exam cycle, and then guidance that we got from the regulators, particularly the NCUA, actually even more so than the FDIC, we've gotten some industry data and we've seen some regulators calculating WARMs, and typically when they're providing those that industry data, that guidance, they're doing it using adjusting for prepayments and the amortization. So pretty much examiners and the regulators accepting and sort of expecting shorter WARMs, recognizing that's going to put even more emphasis on qualitative factor adjustments. And that's kind of the way we've seen it trending over the last couple of years. But certainly if you've been using a methodology that's heavier on the historical aspect and has higher, more conservative WARMs, and your auditors and examiners have been comfortable with that, there is certainly no reason for you to make that shift. However, if you've been getting pressure, if your examiners are looking at those WARMs and saying they're just higher than I think they should be, and they're not letting go of that, then then you can shift and use a different choice here. Bring those WARMs down, just recognizing that you'll probably have to bump Q factors up, because just because you have a shorter WARM doesn't mean they're going to be cool with you having 10 basis points less in your reserve next quarter.
Yeah. So a couple of questions came in, just about the difference between the adjusted for payments and the straight line. So Steve, maybe just quickly touch on that. Again,
between
just the
what I have highlighted here.
Yeah, the areas.
So let me go to a selection here. So these are the couple. Let's focus on these couple methodologies here. Actually, you know what? I'll just do it at the summary. I don't need to get too deep into the weeds. This when you're calculating an average a remaining maturity on a loan, you're pretty much just looking at the date, the current date, and the date that it is contractually ending. And then you want to adjust for prepayments. If you have an expectation of 5, 10, 15% annual prepayments, you're going to take that raw unadjusted remaining maturity, time to maturity from now, and it's going to come down by a certain amount, given a 5, 10, 15% annual prepayment. So once you've made that adjustment, you've gotten to this column. But that does not take into account the fact that your loans, for the most part, not all of them, but are also naturally amortizing over time. So those balances are not, your balances on your existing loans aren't decreasing just for prepayments. They're obviously just amortizing along the way. Now, the only way to do that perfectly is to go loan by loan and have amortization and prepayment assumptions at the loan level. That is beyond the scope and expectation of examiners and auditors for the vast majority of community banks, everyone but the larger banks. So almost nobody on this call is probably doing that. But there is a way to take the portfolio level WARM that is adjusted for prepayments, and then also adjust it for assuming straight line amortization, right? Taking your $10 million in balance and then amortizing it over down to zero over a period of time over the average maturity, and then also taking into account the prepayment. So certainly when you also factor in straight line amortization for the portfolio, it's going to result in a shorter WARM. So if I'm just looking at that particular example, so here's a portfolio level amortization adjustment. For example, let's say you've got $700 million in that portfolio as of today. We're just looking at the loans that are there on day one. Forget growth of new loans in the future, just this existing portfolio of 700. In the first year, you're going to have a certain amount of straight line amortization. You're going to have a certain amount of prepayments. You're going to have a certain amount of total write down of that $700 million portfolio, left with $415 million after year one. Then that $415 million has an additional amount of amortization. It's the same amount, straight line, and then some prepayments as well. And then so you work your way down from your current balance down to a zero balance, and then you can use that to calculate what the average weighted average remaining maturity is using that methodology. So it's different once you have to take into account amortization. It's very straightforward and simple. If you're not taking into account amortization, you simply just have, well, here's my current balance. Here's my maturity date. Here is my years to maturity. Here are the years to maturity for all my loans. Here's the average of those. And you're weighting that average by the balance. And then I'm going to simply take a prepayment estimate and factor that in. So I adjust the WARM down by an 8.7% per year and get to, let's say, 2.64 years. So that methodology, this way of doing it without having to think year by year, is only works at the simplest level. Once you start taking into account amortization adjustments, you got to kind of modify the model here and go year by year until you get to zero, and then calculate the weighted average of that. So just two different ways to do it. This is certainly more conservative, leading to a higher WARM and leading to a probably a higher reserve, or at least a higher historical amount of losses, because you're having losses over 2.64 years as opposed to over 1.81 years. Unless you're recovering stuff ad infinitum, the longer you go, the more reserve losses you will accumulate over time.
And then to the third point, Leo, this is your question. That third one, that option there is for the loan level. And like Steve said, most people on the call, you just don't need to get that granular unless you really have some unique amortizations. We put it in there just as a next level, but yeah, that's a granularity level that really
this you would have to add. You'd be adding all the columns, right, for each of the loans, like here, and then for each individual loan, is it amortizing? Is there a balloon payment at maturity? And plugging those in, and then it calculates kind of this amortization spreadsheet, so to speak, over as many years as you need to, and you can expand as many years out as you need to here. But it's not, that part of it is available, but
it's just
overkill.
It's overkill.
I mean, I see no benefit in doing it unless and until you've pretty much been required, like hard required to do it.
That's right.
Because all in all, you're going to end up with something that I guarantee is not a hill of beans of difference from the portfolio level one. It's just not
right.
And all these little changes are going to average out to being about the same.
Yeah, and I think that's again, we've gotten that question a lot just on the materiality of differences in WARMs. And so I know auditors and regulators, particularly auditors, can get kind of go down rabbit holes on that, but ultimately, particularly around prepayment assumptions, they're just not going to move the needle that much. And so we understand the questions that they have. We explain, how the tool works and why we use the prepayment assumptions that we do. But again, they're just levels of work that we just don't think materially are going to change your WARMs, which then in turn is going to change the analysis. So it just seems like wasted energy and space, but we understand you get those questions. We're here to answer them. But when you do get those questions, that's usually the first response is it's just changes in prepayment rates just don't materially alter the WARMs usually. But again, I think a lot of you probably have had auditors or regulators say, why aren't you calculating your own prepayment estimates? And our answer is always, it's just not worth your time. Right, it's just not going to change the WARM calculation. So we don't want you going down a rabbit hole spending a whole lot of time that's not going to
And
impact
they're asking you
calculation.
to predict the future for something that's based almost solely on the economic cycle.
Yeah,
And if nobody else in the universe can effectively estimate where we're going to be in the economic cycle 2 or 3 years from now, we're not going to have any clue what our average prepayment rate is going to be going forward, because these estimates for the warms, the prepayment estimates for your warm calculations are, if you think about it, we're estimating losses going forward, right? We use history as our guide, but we're estimating going forward. So what they're really asking for is, what are your estimates of prepayments going to be over the next 5 years? And if anyone on this call could answer that, I would love to get some stock tips from you after the call, because there's no way we're going to know whether prepayments on mortgage loans are going to be 5, 10, 15, 20, or 25% 3 or 4 years from now. So
right. Okay, I know we're getting closer here to the hour, but again, just some industry updates that Steve, pulled from UBPR5. So, Steve, if you want to just touch on those real quickly.
hold on, I didn't. Oh, there we go. I lost your screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is you'll recognize this. It's the same format that we use every quarter or so, to show you kind of these granular updates. What we all know, right? We know that past dues have been increasing over the last couple of years. We interestingly did see a decline in the second quarter for the first time in a while in past dues for 1 to 4 family residential at the median and 75th percentile, as well as CRE at the 75th percentile, and even C&I loans had a slight decrease. So after a couple years of I don't want to say relentless, because I don't want to be alarmist here, but consistently bumping up loss levels and deterioration of credit quality amongst community banks for these different loan types, we did see a little relief in the second quarter
Yeah.
for 1 to 4 family and CRE. So those are good leading indicators, but some good signs.
Yeah, certainly good developments.
Now, as we work through the portfolio, work through the balance sheet from the most leading indicators of 30 to 89 days past due, and then we get to non-accrual. Well, non-accrual is going to not be as far, is going to be further along, right? So what we see here is, while 30 to 89 days might have started to see an improvement, the non-accruals are further behind, so they haven't seen an improvement. They see further deterioration. Not a whole lot, but incremental increases, flat to slightly up again when it comes to non-accrual loans across the board. And then finally, charge-offs, where the rubber really meets the road, more so than any other credit quality metric or lots of metrics in community banks. You have to consider seasonality when you're looking at charge-offs. As you see, if you look at the little trend lines on the right there, you see spikes, a couple spikes. Those are the fourth quarter, right? The quote kitchen sink fourth quarters that you see in charge-offs amongst banks. So what I've circled there is second quarter of 2023, second quarter of last year, and second quarter of this year. And while still very manageable on an absolute basis, 0, 2 basis points, 7 basis point, and that's at the 75th percentile for C&I, and then looking at the 90th percentile are on the margins, right? When looking at 75th and 90th percentile loss rates for things like C&I loans and consumer lending, we are continuing to see some increases in gross charge-offs. But still, as you can tell here, I'm looking quarter to quarter, and I'm looking at 75th and 90th percentiles. I'm already stretching it, right, to try to find some sort of a trend here. There is a trend. It is slightly up, but it's really in non-performers. It's not in charge-offs. We're just not seeing it very much still in the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think this is a good illustration again, right, of, the historical, data that we can use. And then going back to the polling question, 44% of you were uncertain about, credit going forward, right? And I think that's really the scale of, kind of your reserve, right? You're taking into account historically what's happened, and then, things that make you uncertain or uncomfortable, right? You might proactively adjust through a Q factor, right? And then ultimately, if it materializes or not. But again, I think that's still why the little bit of the subjectivity comes into play, because if we just solely relied quantitatively we'd all probably have much lower reserves than we do. And the third leg of the stool certainly wants to see between 1 and 1.25.
I mean, if your examiner is pressing you to increase your qualitative factor adjustment and you and increase your reserve, and you've looked at, you looked economically and you looked at your market and you've looked at your customers and you just don't see any additional risk there, showing them and going through the fact that actual net charge-offs, where the rubber really meets the road, continue to really not trend up very much at all at the median level and are still negligible, is with some good data will help you defend that qualitative factor. And on the other side, if you feel like you need to get some more reserve in there, then you can point to and look at the fact that the past dues and non-performers are certainly trending and have been trending upward, except for the dip in the second quarter. We always like to look at things in as many different ways and slice and dice this pie. So we look at regional, and there's the one outlier. I found something new, Sean. I think it's fascinating. There's nothing surprising about this. Reserves are highest on the West Coast, but not hugely different through most of the country. But the Northeast seems to have been getting by with lower levels of reserves than everywhere else in the country as a region. I decided to put this alongside current non-performing loans just to see. And it seems like there's a little bit of anti-West Coast bias amongst our regional offices at the FDIC. You didn't hear that from me. I'm just showing you what the numbers say. But in the second quarter, West Coast community banks had the highest reserve at 128. Northeast had the lowest at 95 basis points. Non-performing loans, significantly higher in the Northeast than not significantly higher in the Northeast than any other region, and significantly lower on the West Coast. So despite having some of the lower levels of non-performing loans currently on the West Coast compared to the rest of the country, they still have the highest levels of reserves. So I don't want to say old habits die hard, but I think the examiners and the regulators on the West Coast, there's decades of effects from some of the credit quality issues that we had on the West Coast during the last credit cycle, and how long they lingered. Certainly somewhat in the South, the Southeast Florida, Georgia area as well, but we haven't seen that as much as the West Coast bias, so to speak.
Yep. Okay, one more.
Yeah, we haven't done this one in a couple quarters. It's such a fascinating little statistic. If you look at unfunded reserves for unfunded commitments, and I know it's a small piece of the reserve puzzle. It probably gets more press than it needs to, but if you just look at median levels of reserves for unfunded commitments, you'd think that it'd be that was increasing significantly, right? As of starting around right after CECL was implemented, we had a median of like zero reserves for unfunded commitments, and that's increased all the way to 16 basis points. However, that's because half the community banks in the country weren't reporting a reserve on their unfunded commitments at all before CECL became a law. Now that's down to 32%. So 70% of you guys being community banks on a whole, 70% of you are now calculating a reserve on the unfunded commitments. 30% of you are still not. What that means is, for those of you who have unfunded commitments and are reserving for them, you've been reserving about 30 basis points almost without fail every single quarter. So it's a misleading statistic to say reserves for unfunded commitments are increasing. For those calculating a reserve for unfunded commitments, it's staying completely flat over the last 2.5 years. But the percentage of you who are realizing or being recommended or required to start calculating that reserve for unfunded commitments it has been increasing significantly. So
exactly, and that's again, I think we all recognize this is probably, we defended early that it should be zero, but the reality is they'd like to see something, and as this points out, 30 basis points somewhere around there seems to be a happy home for those unfunded commitments. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, we included these slides on the scenario management tool. These are all things that we have covered previous coffee talks, this current CECL buzz. We went back and reviewed this, and a lot of the same things we had heard a couple of months ago, we continue to do. So we included those, in our slides, but we haven't really heard necessarily anything new. We just, kind of the same things, particularly around, again, prepayment speeds, qualitative factors, etc. So those will be included in the slides that you get on Monday or Tuesday in the email, but we won't spend any additional time. We also included, we've talked in the past, both on Coffee Talks and our QA webinars, about, our industry research coming soon, where we're improving and enhancing and expanding the amount of interactive data you can utilize and get at. But I don't know that Steve, it's 10 now or 11 Eastern now.
No, I don't think we
save
need
that.
to test drive it. It's the industry research we have now is very dynamic and interactive, where you can choose different peer groups and plot over time those credit trends. We're just vastly expanding that functionality to be for all types of profitability and performance trends, where you can add a median and a 75th percentile for a peer group over time for any metric, and it's a very dynamic visual way to spot those trends. And so we'll be sharing that more as we get closer to it. And
Steve, we had another question come in.
Yes.
Sorry, I want to get to it before folks may have to run. Is the unfunded data you just presented calculated as a percent reserve of total unfunded commitments, or as a percent of total reserves plus unfunded?
It's the reserve as a percentage of the unfunded commitment balance. So just like you would for the loan portfolio.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Doug, I hope that answered your question. Thank you for putting that in. So again, these are all here for you. We'll cover them on, certainly a future presentation. If you have any questions about any of this, certainly reach out. We're happy to jump on a call and go through any of it. If we can help, again, substantiate or just give you different ways to maybe defend Q factors, et cetera. We wanted to point out there's, a lot of information in QwickAnalytics available to you. So, if there's things that you haven't considered, we just wanted to kind of remind you of the kind of, comprehensive, sources of information that are available to you beyond the CECLSolver that you have access to. If there are any final questions, I certainly wanted to give everyone time to submit those now while we're watching for that. Again, just a reminder, you can see past webinars and videos on our YouTube channel. We do also encourage you, if you haven't, again, take us up on our 3-month free trial for IntelliCredit, the portfolio analyzer. You can get a lot more granular detail about your loan portfolio. It's really a great tool to, again, just give you better information, easier to access, build reports that you might be spending, in our opinion, probably too much time on today. So again, certainly reach out to us, info@IntelliCredit. We'd love to talk to you about getting you going on a trial. A couple of webinars coming up. David Ruffin and I will be up on Tuesday, along with Dan Marks, for our mid-year update with the the QCBI performance trends. So certainly, again, encourage you to register. You will get a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And then on August 20th, if you want to learn more about IntelliCredit and the portfolio analyzer, we're doing a webinar with a special guest, Matt Wright. Matt's the loan review officer at Lincoln County Bank Corp. But again, he can kind of explain to you how he's benefited from the portfolio analyzer tool. So again, we don't want you to take our word for it. I think we're helping banks. We'd love to help you. Again, make your life a little bit easier. I think the analyzer can do that. So that webinar, again, encourage you to register. Even if you don't attend, you will get a copy of the slides and a link to the recording that you can listen to at your convenience. We'll be back in September for another edition of Coffee Talk. So if there's anything that you do want us to cover, certainly email that to Steve or I, or to the customer service team or the sales team. We'll incorporate that into our presentation. Steve, any final words before we let everybody off to their Friday and their weekend?
Not today.
All right. Well, thank you all very much again for joining us. I know these have been really, beneficial for Steve and I. We love to share kind of what we're hearing and seeing. We love to get feedback from you. So we're glad you continue to show up. The next one will be September 26th. We hope to see you then. But thank you as always for working with us here at QwickRate and QwickAnalytics and IntelliCredit. We'll look forward to seeing you next month or even next week on a couple of webinars. But thank you very much for attending today. Have a great day and a great weekend, and we will talk soon.
Thanks, everybody.